Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Arroyo Live. From the Pasadena Media Center, I'm Joe Carbonetta. This program is produced by Pasadena Media to help enrich the community through informative and meaningful conversation. Remember, you can share your questions or comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. Despite the steady, albeit slow, rise in COVID vaccinations locally, new infection rates continue to rise, then fall, only to rise again, seemingly on the heels of every holiday celebration and each new change of season. Add to that the more aggressive, now dominant, Delta variant, and the recent discovery of the new Mu variant, with concerns that this new strain may be unfazed by the established vaccines, and you have a situation that could potentially slow or even stop an economy that is, only now, beginning to recover from what arguably has been the most devastating shutdown in more than a century. Tonight, we take a look at COVID and its current effects on our economy. Please join me for Arroyo Live. Joining me this evening are retired epidemiologist Dan Strickland, Paul Thomas, Director of Marketing and Communications for the San Gabriel Valley Economic Partnership, and Brian Wallace, Executive Director for the Playhouse Village Association. Thank you, gentlemen, all for joining me this evening.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
I'd like to begin this evening's conversation by asking each of you in turn to take a moment to tell our viewers at home a little bit more about yourselves.
I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications, as you mentioned, at the San Gabriel Valley Economic Partnership. We're an economic development agency, and we represent, in short term, sort of everybody from Pasadena to Pomona, although we actually extend as far as La Cañada, Flint Ridge, and out to Ontario. My background has largely been in marketing, but I'm fiercely devoted to the San Gabriel Valley, and it's been a really fun journey helping people through the last couple of years, as you can imagine. Got a lot of small businesses to support, and it's a good place to be.
Well, I started in epidemiology as a Peace Corps volunteer in Korea, where I helped with the tuberculosis control program there. Went from there to actually study epidemiology at University of Washington, spent a few years happily as a grad student, and got out, went into academia, taught medical school and graduate school for quite a few years, and did a number of outbreak investigations along the way. Ended up here in Los Angeles working in Kaiser Permanente's Department of Research, from which I retired in 2010, and have been mostly retired since then, although I did go back to Korea for 3 years, a couple of years ago, where I taught undergraduate students for the first time in my life epidemiology at one of their high-tech schools, sort of a Caltech equivalent. That really got my Korean language back into gear. That was a lot of fun.
And Brian.
Thank you. I'm Brian Wallace. I'm the Executive Director of the Playhouse Village Association. We're one of 3 business improvement districts here in Pasadena. We, of course, are in the middle of the downtown, just east of the Civic Center. We are, of course, named for the iconic Pasadena Playhouse, but are really home to a really wide range of uses, increasingly a lot of residents. We have a lot of office space here, a lot of essential retailers that proved quite valuable in the last year and a half, of course, as well as a lot of institutions and nonprofit organizations. So as the organization representing all of those property owners, stakeholders, and institutions, I thank you for letting us be here. My history with Pasadena goes back to the late 90s when the city had a redevelopment agency, and of course, talking about economic development here today, the changes that we've all seen and experienced here in Pasadena statewide, and of course now with the global pandemic, are really quite fascinating. So I'm appreciative to be able to share a little bit of what's going on here in our part of Pasadena. Thank you.
In recent times, of course, we've seen a lot of media coverage devoted to the vaccination rate, of course, not only here locally, but across the country. And locally, we seem to be doing pretty well. Here in California, our vaccination numbers are steadily, though slowly, climbing. Across the nation, it's a different story. I want to start off with a question based on a report, an article from BMC Infectious Diseases, which seems to indicate that it's very unlikely that we will be eradicating the COVID-19 virus. I'm wondering, perhaps this question goes mostly to Dan, but I would like to direct it to everyone. What is the likelihood that we will see any type of eradication of this infection? Or is this something we're going to be dealing with from this point forward?
It's not going to be eradicated. This is going to be something we'll live with for the foreseeable future. There's only been 2 diseases in all of history that have ever been eradicated. Anyway, one of which is not even a human disease, it's an animal disease. So talking about it in terms of that is simply not going to happen. What we talked about early in the pandemic with the US was reaching herd immunity as a way that the pandemic could be kept under control. And that was sort of a level that we calculated from the early variants of the virus, a level around 66%. But with the Delta variant, we're talking 80 to 88%, and we have people who are reluctant to get vaccinated. So herd immunity looks like more and more of something that we won't reach either.
We have now heard reports of a new variant, the Mu variant, which some are concerned may actually be resistant to the vaccine. How likely is this? And perhaps even more important, how likely is it that we will see further variants that are unaffected by the vaccine?
Oh, it's very likely that we're going to see further variants. For them to be unaffected by the vaccine is pretty unlikely, in my opinion, bearing in mind I'm not a virologist. But the vaccine are targeted at the proteins on the spike proteins on the virus. Viruses need those to enter the cells. And if the virus mutates such that the spike proteins have changed, that also affects their ability to infect the host. So it seems pretty unlikely that they'll be able to evade the vaccines. And even if they are, the messenger RNA technology is such that we can quickly tool up and find a way to get around that immunity.
Based on what you're saying, it does sound as though for the foreseeable future, we are looking at a situation where, at the very least, we'll be getting an annual COVID shot in much the same way that we have come to expect an annual flu shot. Based on the way the virus continues to mutate, is it possible that we could be seeing booster shots, if you will, more frequently than once a year because of the speed at which this virus seems to mutate?
The mutation speed doesn't really have anything to do with it. It's how long the immunity stays around. And the data a few months ago wasn't real solid on it, but it's looking better and better that the immunity persists for longer than we thought it did. So I am speculating a bit here, but I don't see booster shots being needed more than once a year. Chickenpox has a similar rate of spread, and we all get chickenpox vaccinations from time to time. I just had to undergo shingles vaccination, which is, of course, the same virus, a couple of weeks back. And boy, you think COVID vaccines are nasty. Let me tell you, shingles vaccine knocks you flat.
We've heard a lot of discussion about the rise again in COVID infections, again precipitated largely by the Delta variant and the fact that it does appear to be a more aggressive variant than the original COVID virus that we saw a year ago. We have heard reports that based on the numbers of infections we've seen, that would have been enough if we were still under such restrictions to trigger a shutdown in the economy again. Do all of you see that as likely that this would have been the case if we were still using the colored tier system?
I think shutdown's a big word. I think that certainly people need to be taking more precautions. But shutdown, that's a lot to say.
Brian, I'm wondering if you have an opinion on this.
The question is not so much whether we should be back in shutdown. And I think most people would argue that's probably not politically or otherwise feasible anymore at this juncture. But whether would we then be that if we didn't have the vaccine, for example, and that might be possible. But from what we understand, the public have been encouraged to get vaccinated such that we have to be able to avoid further shutdowns and harms to the economy. So enough people are getting that message and are able to sort of play that role now that didn't exist a year ago. Remember, a year ago when that was our discussion, we had no prevention. We also knew that much less about the spread and about the virus. So whether or not we would be in that today, largely, I think, seems to depend on the vaccines.
Certainly in this evening's discussion, we're talking about the virus itself and the resurgences that we've heard about, and the potential for an even greater resurgence, of course, as we're coming out of a holiday weekend. But we're also talking about the economic damage that was brought on by the original approach to the virus, which was a shutdown. And perhaps that was necessitated by the fact that there was no vaccine at the time. Of course, when the vaccines came to market or became available, there was an idea that things are going to return to normal. And for a short period of time, we saw numbers of infections on the decline. We saw businesses trying to reopen their doors. Was that a mistake to go back to a full capacity, everything's back to normal, we're all going to be okay approach? In hindsight, should we have done things more cautiously?
The problem is that we really don't have a public health program to stop a pandemic. Whenever you build a public health intervention based on trying to get individuals to change behavior from the onset, it's going to fail. And that's what's happened in the US. I was tracking the epidemic in 2020 because Korea's first patient occurred at the same time as the first patient in the US. And I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but the Korean epidemic rose fairly quickly and then fell off again a couple of months later because of the infrastructure that they had in place. And I was expecting the US to do the same thing. I didn't realize the US had problems to the degree that we do with our public health infrastructure. And we seem to have focused on magic bullet solutions, lockdown, masks, because it's one of these, excuse the phrase, ancient Oriental secrets that Japan and Taiwan and Korea adopted that seems to have stopped their pandemics. And then vaccinations. And you cannot stop an epidemic with one bullet solutions. It just won't work, and you see the results.
Well, I would like to ask you to go into a little bit more detail. You mentioned the infrastructure that Korea has versus our own. What could you be a little more specific? What about their infrastructure differs from ours?
Well, they have a national health insurance system, for starters. Most countries have some sort of single payer or central healthcare delivery system. That's crucial. People don't have to worry about the cost when they go in to get diagnosed or treated. 98% of Koreans have a smartphone, and they were able to download a tracking app that anonymously lets them know when they've been near someone who tested positive for COVID and isolate themselves. Most countries, including Korea, offer paid time off. A number of countries, including, for example, Canada, have paid citizens $2,000 a month for the duration of the epidemic and given a considerable amount of support to small businesses. I have a good friend over in Eagle Rock, the karate gym where I work out, The owner there's a small business, and he's really been struggling through this because of the difficulty of finding support. And Korea also has a public health system that is good at surveillance and uses a technique called backward contact tracing, so they can find where people got the COVID from, and that way they can do what's called cluster busting, find what we sometimes call super spreading events. Those are some of the infrastructure changes that are necessary, and some of them are pretty big for the US. National health insurance, that would be a big change, but if we don't do something like that, we're just going to keep having problems with pandemics.
Well, from an economic standpoint, I am approaching this next question, but Dan, you bring up an interesting point in that countries like Korea had introduced tracking applications for smartphones that allowed them to see where infections were in fact surging. There were attempts to introduce those tracking apps here in the US. In a country where people so freely give of information in social media platforms like Facebook, Snapchat, pick your poison, was it surprising to any of you gentlemen the backlash that came from the idea of an anonymous tracking application? How destructive was that to the economy that people simply refused to partake in such an operation?
Not surprising. To our credit or to our detriment, we're very independent. And like Dan, I've spent a number of years in Asia, and there's something that they have which we resist. And in some ways that has to do with issues exactly like what you're describing, Joe. We have an intrinsic revulsion for anything that we think is getting into our privacy. On the other hand, we click accept every time that somebody asks us when we download an app and it says, "Oh, have you read the terms and conditions?" Oh, of course I've read the terms and conditions. And I think the difference is that we feel like we're doing that as an individual, that I'm giving up whatever the terms and conditions were. I'm pushing that button as an individual. And if someone else came to us and said, push that button, we would push back. So I'm sorry if I sound a little cynical. I love my country. I live here on purpose. It's a great place, but we have our character like everyone does.
So I've lived in the UK, and you talk about a National Health Service. They're very proud of that, right? The NHS. Unfortunately, they had pretty severe time with COVID, about, I guess, statistically as bad as the US. In some ways, maybe some metrics were worse, and lots of lockdowns, lots of back and forth. But there too, there is that sense of sort of collective societal purpose and commitment, having lived through 2 world wars in their doorstep and rationing for food for decades and all materials. It's a very different mindset. So it's no wonder that approaches in countries, and New Zealand locked everyone out and kept cases to 0 until recently. Of course, we were. So I found it fascinating that Dan said there really is no silver bullet magic pill here, as it were, for this to have gone. But I think it did clearly shed light on the fact that each country is taking an individualistic approach about how to do this, and ours happens to be an experiment just like others, and unfortunately, a lot of people are suffering for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you describe it as an experiment. It seems that as experiments go, we are failing, as our nation consistently ranks the highest in terms of new infections, I believe. If that's not correct, Dan, perhaps you can tell me otherwise.
Maybe Brazil's got us beat, but we're right up there.
So would there have been a better way to approach the idea of such a tracking application in your opinion or estimation? How should we have done this that we could have been more successful?
I'm going to throw this out there, and I'm not a sociologist, but I think that with my experience living in Europe and in Asia, I would say that if you could somehow make people feel like they were choosing the right way to go, they might choose differently. And what we've done in the United States has been largely, well, either you impose it from above or you use your individual rights against it. And that's not going very well. So, like I said, I'm not a sociologist, but it does seem like that's really kind of part of the issue.
Well, and building on your idea that things are not going that well, what we are currently left with are businesses that cannot quite operate at full capacity. From a business person's standpoint, how detrimental is that to any particular business, be it a restaurant or a movie theater or even a hair salon?
It's been incredibly destructive. I mean, the San Gabriel Valley, one of the most beautiful things we have is what you'd call colloquially mom and pop businesses. And I moved back here from China a few years ago, and it was like a little paradise where I could go and get exactly the food I wanted. And a lot of the people running those businesses, they've suffered the absolute most, because when I say mom and pop, I mean literally you've got 3 people running a restaurant. And it's a beautiful cultural thing that we have here. And it has been almost impossible for those people because their locations don't allow for outdoor dining. Their kitchen really is one person with 2 other people running the store. It's been terrible. It's been terrible. I'm sorry to be doom and gloom on this, but it's been wonderful working to help support those people over the last year, but it's been very hard. Been very hard.
Well, speaking of outdoor dining, Governor Newsom just signed into law the idea that outdoor dining will continue and alcohol to go. Those concepts will be continued at least through the end of this year. But there are political officials who are pushing back on that idea as well, because it is basically taking over public use areas and devoting them to for-profit endeavors. What are your gentlemen's opinion on the outdoor dining? Should it continue? Should we go back to business as usual?
I'll jump in on this one. At Playhouse Village here, we were fortunate, again, because of the pandemic, to really benefit from the city's investment in creating on-street dining areas on Colorado. Of course, there were several others in other parts of our city and all over the region and the country. Of course, a lot of cities have done this first as a sort of mitigating measure against shutdowns of indoor dining, of course, but also as an attempt to understand what is the role and purpose of public space. And that's something that we have explored in our organization in Pasadena for many years. And this exercise in looking at streets, for example, has been helpful in the sense that it opens up the mindset of how streets can best serve a community. Is it best served to park one car at a time, or is it best served to seat 20 diners at a time? And talking about economic recovery and community sort of spirit and vitality, these are different metrics than we were looking at streets before, for example. There are other examples of outdoor dining that aren't on streets, and those might be a little simpler to sort of go forward on a equitable basis. But yes, I think for our city, I know that the city of Glendale is looking at investing even more public funds into those kinds of areas. Our city may or may not, we as an organization are looking to do that as well. But the fact that we have seen the response of people liking the outdoor dining, and with the ongoing mutating variants, the need for that to be an option, it's still my first option with my family because I have unvaccinated kids, right? And at least for what we know now, that's the best protection we can have for ourselves. So in lieu of not going out at all, it at least provides the opportunity to do that. But at the same time, really helping explore what is the purpose of public space and how best does that serve a community.
Well, I think the trick there, though, is that Pasadena is very blessed. Pomona, Monrovia, Glendora. There are certain cities that have the ability to do more. And it's fantastic. I live near Laverne, and they cut down D Street and made it outdoor dining. And it's like I've got my little Europe outside. It's really cool. That isn't a luxury, unfortunately, in Rosemead or El Monte or a lot of other cities in the southern half of the valley. And it's not going to be fair in the long run. I think we're learning some really beautiful things, and I think it's really cool. I love what they did with Colorado. I love what they did with downtown Laverne. But there are businesses that don't have that as wiggle room, and it's going to be tough for people in the long run. So I totally agree. But it's tough. It is really tough.
Yeah, my buddy who runs the karate gym in Eagle Rock has been struggling along. He, for some time, was holding classes on the parking lot, which not a big parking lot, out behind his gym. And at the same time, even before he was doing that, he was converted to Zoom. And Zoom, karate lessons over Zoom are kind of iffy at best. And I know some youngsters who teach dance lessons too, and they've been doing dance lessons over Zoom. And it sort of works, sort of doesn't. So it's a struggle for people like that.
Yeah.
Well, another question that has been at the forefront almost since the beginning of the pandemic is the grand question of to mask or not to mask. In the early moments of the pandemic, we were told that masks weren't important. Later, we heard that that was actually a ploy to try and keep those masks available for those folks in the medical sector. Later on, we were told masks were very, very important and perhaps one of the biggest keys to preventing the spread. Since then, we have seen a lot of backlash against the idea of mandatory masking. We've gone from being told you must wear a mask to being told you didn't have to wear a mask. The latest information from the CDC is if you've been vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, but if you aren't vaccinated, you do. Of course, this is all on the honor system. For starters, I would like to go back and ask Dan about the effectiveness of wearing a mask. How much is this doing to hold back an explosion in the pandemic?
Well, to answer that up front, it does quite a lot. Those are effective. However, the problem that you're alluding to is something that's very important in public health that we have done a miserable job at, which is communication. We really didn't say early on that we don't know enough about whether the masks are effective or not to be able to say whether they'd be a good barrier to infection. We simply did not know. And so we were kind of wishy-washy about it. Now that the data have accumulated over the past year and a half, we can say pretty firmly that, yeah, they sure do work and you'd better be using them, especially if you're teaching elementary school up in Marin County and you've got allergies and it turns out that what you've actually got is COVID and you're passing the bug to all your kids because you unmask when you're telling stories. They work. And even if you're vaccinated, it's not a bad idea to be using them because the Delta variant can pile up in your nose and possibly you could spread it if you're not masked. Although, as I say, again, early times with the Delta variant, so the data haven't quite accumulated enough yet. And I'm going to say something that the media doesn't say often enough. We don't really know yet.
Well, we certainly have heard reports of what the media refers to as, and perhaps the medical industry as well, breakthrough cases where people who have been vaccinated do then, in fact, proceed to come down with the COVID virus, though the number of hospitalizations has been remarkably low. But even there have been a few vaccinated people that have ended up in intensive care as a result of, we're being told, the Delta variant. Again, you can double check me if I'm wrong on those facts, Dan. I defer to your medical expertise here.
No, you're right. We're hearing about the breakthrough vaccinations and breakthrough infections, and both from vaccinated people and people who've had COVID in the past. It's rare. It's quite rare. But because the disease is so common, you hear about it a lot. And especially people tend to hear about friends and acquaintances and relatives who've had a breakthrough infection. And people take anecdotal information and magnify it in their minds. Well, if I've heard about it, it must be fairly common sort of phenomenon. So yes, that's a concern. It's still rare. I would like to remind us, though, that chickenpox, which spreads at about the same rate as the Delta variant of COVID, also has a vaccine that works at about the same rate, has the same effectiveness as the COVID vaccines. So you can make an easy comparison if you're curious of how does chickenpox spread and vaccine work compared to COVID, and they're pretty much the same.
Well, the second part of this masking issue really has to do with the idea that, again, the most recent instruction from the CDC has been that if you are vaccinated, you don't need to have a mask in most public settings. Of course, indoors, it's a different story. If you are unvaccinated, you are supposed to be wearing a mask at all times. Of course, when you do get a vaccination for COVID, you are given a piece of paper, a card, if you will, that indicates what vaccine you had and when you were given it. And it is verifiable proof that you have been vaccinated. Of course, there has been pushback at the idea that you might have to present that card to demonstrate that you are in fact vaccinated. This then leaves the onus on business owners to enforce the idea that if you have been vaccinated, you don't have to wear the mask. And if you aren't, you must wear the mask. How fair is that, and how difficult is that for business owners to be stuck basically policing this health issue?
Yeah, they don't want to be police for this issue. I mean, and right now, Pasadena has a mask mandate in place, so that at least has made it a little easier for them not to get into that level of fray, right? But for example, take the Playhouse, which has been closed since March of 2020, looking forward to an opening in November with a big show for which they will require vaccinations, and they will be doing door checks. And this has been a very challenging process for them to understand how will that play out. I have not been yet at a venue, restaurant, store where my status was checked. I think I have a screenshot on my phone, so I could be prepared to show it. But I don't know that we're yet at the stage where we're seeing a lot of that. And again, there's a risk factor involved and a comfort level of the anticipated patron. So the theater goer who is going to be in a seat for hours on end in very close proximity to a lot of people for an extended time is a higher level of risk perceptively than walking into Ralph's for 10 minutes to get my shopping. So again, they don't want to be police. They've tried to put it off as long as possible. But for the sake of going forward with life, I think that we will start to see this in some fashion. I know San Francisco are doing this a lot with bars and restaurants. Again, don't know of any here. They may exist. Our theaters will start that, but it's yet a little bit of unproven ground, at least that I'm aware right now here.
And this next question may really be kind of above and beyond the scope of everyone here. I know that no one here is a lawyer, but is there a precedent for even requiring proof of vaccination? Certainly, hospitals are not allowed to hand out your medical information due to HIPAA privacy laws. Can a business legally require you to show proof of any medical procedure as a requirement to gain entrance? Certainly, businesses have the right to refuse service for a lot of things, not wearing a shirt. We're all familiar with the no shoes, no shirt, no service mantra. But is this something that could potentially put a business owner in a legal conundrum if they, in fact, do reach the point where they start requiring proof of vaccination?
I'm going to raise a point that's going to be half joking. I'm envisioning large bouncers standing at the front door of the Pasadena Playhouse, checking for vaccination status, much as they do for bars looking for kids who are under drinking age.
Yeah, I recently had the privilege to go on a brief tour of some glaciers in Alaska, and we were all required to wear masks the whole time you were on the boat, which was like 7 hours. And the captain very wisely said, you know what? We're all working really hard here. Please, those people who are working really hard to make you happy all day and taking your pictures for you, don't make those people the police. Just don't. And I think, sadly, in the American context, at least, we have to just be good to each other. And there's no way to police that, but it is something we have to think about. I don't think people will take kindly to the bouncer outside the Playhouse. But I do think that we can at least appeal to each other's decency and dignity at some level. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know. Sorry, Joe. You look like you think I'm naive.
No, not at all. I was about to say that earlier in talking with Dan, he offered a few suggestions on ways that we could proceed from a medical standpoint that might improve the outcome of the pandemic. I was going to ask both you, Paul, and Brian, if there are suggestions from perhaps a business or a municipal standpoint, things that we could be doing, things that we should be doing that might improve the outcome and perhaps allow us to move a little bit closer to normal or what used to be considered normal.
Brian, you're in Pasadena. You've dealt with some of this more than I have. I've been watching what's happened in Pasadena, what's happened in West Covina. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think the thing that is fortunate about Pasadena is, by and large, it's a very well-informed community, very engaged community, very committed community. So I believe, Dan can correct, or we can double check this stat, it's the highest vaccinated rate public health entity, maybe that's a city or an agency in the state, at least. I believe it's 80+%. So I think a little of this comes down to sort of community identity. It's higher, clearly, I think, is what I'm getting from that. It's a little bit of a sort of community commitment and what kind of a community do we want to have and support? And if supporting the community means at this juncture, our best avenue is to get vaccinated, then Pasadena is stepping up to do that. It's a smaller city. It's very well informed, so maybe that's easier to do. We have a health department that can be a more reliable source of information and a resource for all of that work. And I think that is an interesting sort of look into how a community maybe can support itself, how it can choose to support itself right now, as opposed to larger communities or less communities that are less able to do that. But again, the notion of checking vaccination cards, and our colleague here, Dan, said, the bouncer at the door. Well, it may not be far from that, and at least that might be the appearance. But again, because of the community's commitment already to getting vaccinated, it doesn't seem that it's going to be crisis level news, fighting in the streets about it. So again, we're hopeful. It's unproven ground. We have to try it out and see. It's the only tool we have, absent some other vaccine mandate or some other proven step that would allow us to reopen differently. And I don't know what those would be. I'd love to hear that from Dan. What is a post-vaccine strategy for reopening? That's all we've kind of got right now. But
Just a bit of administrative trivia here that people may not be aware of. There are only 3 cities in the state that have public health departments: Pasadena, Long Beach, and Berkeley. Everybody else has county health departments.
West Covina is trying.
Well, we were talking about the need or the usefulness of wearing masks, and of course the mandatory versus non-mandatory masking policies. Again, with an eye toward the business owners, what about the idea of compelling employees to get vaccinated? And I bring this up because recent reports in the media centering on some of the major airlines, we have now seen or heard that some of these major airlines are imposing mandatory vaccination policies, and in fact, city and county employees likewise. But where the airlines are concerned, a very recent report, which has come out within the last day, suggests that for employees who are vaccinated or choose to get vaccinated, if they then subsequently become infected with the COVID virus and have to take time off from work, their time off will be with pay. Conversely, for those employees who refuse to get vaccinated, if they come down with the COVID virus, they will have to take time off without pay. One of the major airlines has even gone so far as to impose a policy whereby if you refuse to get vaccinated, you will also have to pay an additional $200 per month out of your check for your health insurance benefits. To that end, how do business owners feel about the idea of imposing these mandatory vaccinations? And is that a good idea?
There's a pretty broad spectrum of business owners out there. I think that it'd be fair to say that many, or perhaps most, would be horrified by the idea. But we live in a very litigious state. And I think airlines are particularly at risk because you're in a very small space with recirculated air. And I don't know the science behind that. Sorry, Dan. But I think they are particularly at risk. So I guess that's a very hard question to answer because so many businesses feel so differently. I was listening to an interview with a bunch of band managers talking about taking people on tour recently. And they said that they were requiring all of their crew members to be vaccinated. And everybody in that industry seemed fine with it. I think if you did that in a lot of other industries, probably most, people would go through the roof for ideological reasons, maybe scientific ones. I don't know. So,
yeah, one of my sisters works in the industry. She's a first AD, and she's been impressed with the degree to which the industry is taking care of itself. But I've been alarmed more than the transportation industry about fire and police departments. Beverly Hills Police Department, Fire Department is a particular problem that alarmed me because early on when the Delta variant hit, the first places we saw it when we were looking at maps of the outbreak was Lancaster, Palmdale, and Beverly Hills. So that's worrisome.
Well, switching gears just a little bit, by the middle of July, we had seen a resurgence of infections, and that was largely attributed to people getting together over the 4th of July holiday. Very, very recently, we are coming off of the Labor Day holiday, and the effects of people congregating over that 3-day period are yet to be seen. We will probably have to wait a week or two to see what the numbers look like. But as we are approaching the end of the year, of course, the holidays begin to come fast and furious, and some of the biggest holidays are fast approaching, those, of course, being Christmas and New Year's, Thanksgiving as well. Is there a plan for these holidays that are approaching, and is there concern over what this is going to do from a medical standpoint, as well as from a commerce standpoint?
We haven't got a public health program. And the holidays that are coming up are going to be holidays that take place for most of the country in cold weather, so they'll be indoors. It's likely to be a mess. And incidentally, in the big gatherings, the holidays that you missed, there was also a clear spike in disease after the motorcycle gathering in Sturgis recently. So that one worked out as predicted, just as it did in 2020.
So are businesses prepared to deal with the onslaught of patrons that invariably come with these holidays, especially, as I say, Christmas, New Year's? These are traditionally really big periods, and also in the retail industry. A lot of shopping is done at that time. What kind of plans are in place? And especially with the limitations on the number of people in a business, what are we looking at for the holiday season this year?
I don't hear a lot of chatter about it, to be really honest. I haven't really heard a lot of people talking about Black Friday and how they're going to manage it. I think one of the greatest downsides for the past year has been that most shopping has honestly been online. Things have shifted heavily towards not brick and mortar stores, which it pays in Los Angeles County. We pay a big toll for that because it's a lot of our income. I haven't heard a lot of people concerned about it as yet. I suspect they're probably going to go at it the same way, say, Disneyland has, and say, we're going to limit the number of people, but we'll scoot by. I don't know. That's a tough question. I'm sorry, I can't give a solid answer for that one.
Brian, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that yourself.
Well, right. Again, you referenced earlier about the tiered reopening and the capacity restrictions. That, as we all famously remember, on June 15th went away. So there are no more capacity restrictions technically, as far as we're aware. So what the retailers and restaurants are responding to is more consumer behavior and preference, right? So dining, I referenced earlier, wherein irrespective of the labor issues, which is a big part of the conversation, no matter which industry still right now we're talking about, particularly in the service sector for people. But taking that aside, it's more about comfort level. And if I can offer outdoor dining and indoor dining, then I've got my bases covered. If I can create a safe environment and I need to put in some capacity restrictions, I was at Trader Joe's after the supposed full reopening, and they were still queuing people up because they deemed themselves to be at capacity. Maybe that's a fire code capacity number, I'm not sure, but it wasn't a COVID number per se. But I think you'll find that there is a comfort level that each merchant might undertake, and each patron is going to have to realize what he or she's comfortable with. In a big store like Best Buy, I might be okay to browse for a little while. In a small mom and pop, as Paul was referencing, that might be overcrowded for a particular sale, that might be something I skip. And that, again, is maybe unfortunate for those kinds of merchants. So I too, though, as Paul said, haven't heard a lot about it. There are still inventory issues and labor issues that are top of mind right now. And even looking out 3 weeks, let alone 3 months, is very challenging.
Yeah, I think Brian nails it on the head there. The inventory and labor is probably going to be a more significant impact on the shopping season than the willingness of people to head into a store. I think it's going to be huge. So.
And obviously the inventory shortage, it has been brought on largely by the labor shortage. But that brings up an interesting question. How much of that labor shortage is due to either infection with COVID-19 or people concerned about becoming infected with COVID-19? And how much of it is actually brought on by people feeling that they are actually doing better, simply availing themselves of some of the relief efforts that have been made as a result of the earlier economic shutdown?
I guess that's a question for me. So recently, we advertised for 3 positions, 2 of which were full-time, good positions, and we got enormous numbers of applicants, more than we could sort through on a lot of days. There was a 3rd position, which was a part-time position with possibility to go full-time. A lot of elbow grease, not an easy position, but an interesting position, but not with the same securities as those other two. We got very few applicants. I don't know what to tell you there, except that people are applying for good jobs. And I don't know if dock worker in San Pedro is a good job or not. I don't know. But I do know that they're very shorthanded down there. What the people's motivation is, I'm not the person to judge. And I think that would take a lot of work to find out really what was going on. I think there's a litmus test there. It's a Rorschach test, you know?
Well, it is only logical and perhaps human nature that people are going to gravitate towards the good jobs. And when you say good jobs, obviously we're referring to those that are of a higher pay scale. Part of the reason I posed the last question is, of course, we've seen lots of reports in the media of there being a labor shortage across the board and enterprising businesses having to come up with incentives to get people to apply and hire on. Those incentives range from same day hiring to cash bonuses to increases in benefits, all of which sound fantastic if you're a prospective employee. But how sustainable is this long term for business owners? And if they do attempt to sustain them, how likely is it that as a consumer, I'm going to see an across the board increase in pricing in the coming months?
Well, you're already seeing price increases. And that was before we had the labor shortages because of supply and demand imbalance. But now with labor wages being driven up, the attenuant price increases are going to happen. Chipotle is famous for announcing the $15 wage, and we're increasing our burritos by 8% as well. So the reality is already here. I think what the society will have to grapple with is maybe before the pandemic, we didn't view these positions, and we might label them all essential worker positions, whatever you want to call the ones who provide services for others, right? Be they food or goods or whatever, as not really that tangible to me, right? Because I'm not aware of their life station or how much they're making. But now it's really been unearthed, and the importance of the work they do to make sure I can go to buy groceries has been put in front of my face. So is there more of an acceptance on those that have greater means to offset those with some cost increases? I would argue people are already voting yes, because the demand for goods and services has not declined. Incomes are coming up. I think recently it was the largest wage rise, particularly for the lower wage classes in many, many years. And we were already seeing the price increases. So I don't know that it's an either or. I think it's already happening. We just need to understand what as a community are we placing as a value structure. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on right now.
Well, and certainly we've seen some business owners, at least in the short term, justify these incentives because of the radical increase in business that they're currently seeing as we came out of the lockdown. But is it possible in the long term that these very steps that we were taking to try and return our economy to a functional status may ultimately cause it to slow and stop again as these increased wages and increased prices become untenable for the average consumer?
Well, you're probably getting into a little bit of economist territory, and maybe neither Paul nor I is really qualified to fully answer. But I think in general, there is an adjustment going on. We know that there's an adjustment going on just in where people have their office. And so you can extrapolate that across thousands of office buildings and millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world. And you can realize that that's just one sector of how people work that's changing. Are there other sectors that are going to change too? And that's just something that's been accelerated. There's a lot of talk about, we had 10 years of call it progress or change that happened in 10 months during the pandemic. That's still playing out. And we're still, I think, unearthing some of this that we're going to have to live through and see. Is this a great a readjustment. There's all sorts of names about the labor readjustment that is occurring, and it's, I think, still in its very early stage.
Well, one last question for all of you gentlemen this evening. Of course, we were talking a little earlier about the idea that the holidays are coming, that we will see a lot more gatherings, and historically what we've seen in the wake of those gatherings is a massive increase in the number of COVID infections. From both a medical standpoint and from a local business standpoint, if the worst should come to pass after New Year's and we see a massive spike in COVID infections, can we, again, from a medical standpoint and from a business standpoint, can we weather another shutdown? Is that something that we can afford?
If we've learned some lessons, at least in the white collar part of the business world, I think we can. I think we've learned a lot about living without so much overhead. Now, that's bad news for real estate, and that's a big industry here in the San Gabriel Valley too. And those people, they have my heart. But it could be a sea change, possibly. I don't know. But as far as the office worker goes, yeah, I think we could weather it. As far as the people who are trying to survive nursing and working as a grocery store clerk, you're asking a lot. I mean, not you, but one is asking a lot, and it'll be tough.
Dan, and are the hospitals prepared to deal with another massive round of infections?
No. I mean, you see it going on, especially in Louisiana right now, and Mississippi, and a couple other places. They're having to shuffle people out of state. And if we get an outbreak over the winter like we had last year, which to me seems unlikely given the proportion of vaccinated people, still, it's going to be very difficult. We need to remember that the vaccination is lumpy. There are places where there's plenty of vaccinated people. There are places where there are not. Excuse me. And so you'll see hospital capacity being hit hard in places where that vaccination rate is very low, and we'll be seeing the same sorts of disastrous effects that we saw last winter, I think, in places where there's been that much resistance. Could get very, very bad.
Well, all right. I'm afraid that we have run out of time and reached the end of our program this evening. I would like to again thank Mr. Dan Strickland, Mr. Brian Wallace, and Mr. Paul Thomas for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, gentlemen, and we truly appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
To our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed on our program, you can email them to us at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until next time, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thank you for watching, and good night.